every time the world almost ended. I don't know about you guys, but to me, it seems like doomsday scares are only becoming more and more common. Every day, we're either being told that the world is going to end or actively ending, and honestly, I'm just sick of it. If you're old enough to qualify for a senior's discount, then you might remember the Y2K scare of the year 2000. And if you're at least old enough to use this website, then you might remember the 2012 scare where the world was supposed to end as well. Regardless, all of these fake world-ending events got me thinking, what were genuine times in history when the world was its closest to ending? And well, my findings are this video. And as always, this video is only going to get crazier as it goes on. The Carrington event. It's a warm summer's night on August 28th, 1859. The sun had only just set, and this night was supposed to be like any other. Typically, after the sun sets, the sky only gets darker and darker. However, on this night, the sky was illuminated like never before. Eyewitnesses report that the sky appeared to be illuminated from the heavens, and others mentioned how the sky was a deep red as if it were engulfed by a wildfire. The night sky was so bright, in fact, that it actually awoke gold miners working in the Rocky Mountains, and they not only woke up, but began their workday in the middle of the night because they assumed the sun had risen. And it's reported that in New York, you could even read the newspaper at midnight due to how bright the night sky was. With this being said, it begs the question, what was in the night sky? Was it an asteroid? Was it a wildfire? Well, some of you might have already guessed that it was the Aurora Borealis. But these were no regular northern lights. The lights that were seen in the night sky on August 28th were visible for nearly a week. But it's not just the duration that's impressive. These lights were visible globally. Not only was the aurora visible from the North and South Poles, but it was also visible through North America, South America, Cuba, Hawaii, Japan, China, and even New Zealand. But this aurora wasn't just a pretty light show. Although it was an interesting spectacle to witness at night, during the day, this aurora was wreaking havoc on the rather simple technology that existed, most notably telegraphs. Because of the geomagnetic-induced current from the electromagnetic field, telegraphs all across the world failed. But not only did they fail, they even shocked the operators. Telegraphs in some locations were sparking, breaking, and curiously, in some locations, telegraph operators were disconnecting their batteries from the telegraphs, and the telegraphs would still work without power. There's even a recorded conversation between two telegraph operators in Boston and Portland, who both disconnected the batteries from their telegraphs, but were still able to have a 2-hour-long conversation. And while this is interesting, it doesn't necessarily sound apocalyptic. And well, you'd be right. And that's because the Carrington event was caused by a massive solar flare, an event that is typically pretty harmless to humans. However, I wanted to mention it first in this video for two reasons. One, because it's the most tame entry on this list we're going to discuss, and two, because it's extremely interesting to theorize what would have happened if this solar storm happened in the modern day, a day where we rely so heavily on technology. And luckily, we don't have to speculate, because in June of 2013, a joint venture from researchers at Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Committee used real data from the Carrington event to estimate the cost of a similar event in the modern day. And what they estimated was that if the Carrington event took place in 2013, it would have cost in the US alone $600 billion to $2.6 trillion in damages, which at the time would have ranged from roughly 3 to 15% of the annual GDP for the entire country. But numbers aside, what would this look like for humans? And the reality is scary. Most of the world would experience one of the biggest blackouts of all time. And this blackout alone would cause major issues, such as lack of communications, lack of transportation, lack of refrigeration, and so much more. Traffic lights would go down, hospitals would lose power, air traffic control would lose communication with planes, grocery stores would be empty, looting and riots would begin. Like, seriously, just imagine if the world lost electricity for even 2 weeks straight. Now imagine that going on for months, and maybe even years. So much would be going wrong. Besides just that, all banking and purchases would be unavailable, supply chains would basically completely halt, and the economy and likely civilization would be set back hundreds of years, if not eliminated entirely. And that's really not an exaggeration. If a Carrington event took place in the modern day, and it was not detected in advance and precautions were not taken in advance, then it's estimated that it would take up to a decade for all of the power grids that were affected by the solar storm to be fully restored. Now, before you get too scared about a whole modern day Carrington event, understand that with modern technology, we would be able to detect and plan for a Carrington level event to ensure that none of this happens. But before I give you too much hope, understand that some experts say that Carrington level events take place every roughly 150 years. And the last Carrington event was 160 years ago, meaning that to some, we could be overdue. Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is likely one of the most famous historical situations that had relatively minimal casualties, but could have potentially resulted in the most casualties ever recorded. I think it's safe to assume that most of us are familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, I will give a brief summary for those who are not so familiar. But beyond that, I want to focus not only on the entire situation, but on some of the more notable events that took place within the missile crisis that brought us inches from nuclear war between two of the world's largest superpowers. In October of 1962, the Soviet Union decided to secretly put nuclear missiles within Cuba. This secret operation was quickly exposed to the American government, and instantly concerns were high. Why are the Soviets breaking their agreement, and why are they putting nuclear warheads 90 miles away from our soil? Tensions were obviously at an all-time high, and slow communication and language barriers did not make the situation any easier. Once these secret missiles were exposed, the US government knew they had to respond, but they had to also be strategic because they knew the wrong response could result in nuclear war. It's kind of ironic because at this time, America already had nuclear warheads in Turkey off the coast of Russia. However, with the Soviets now having nukes off the coast of America, things were serious. And while I know that's an oversimplified explanation, it's kind of all I got for right now. But one interesting observation I'll make was that although tensions were extremely high, from my understanding, the leaders of both the United States and the Soviet Union did not want to go into a nuclear war, obviously because they both knew very well that this could result in the end of humanity. However, for the soldiers that were actually on site seeing their enemy directly in front of them, the urge to take shots and potentially start a war was a lot more appealing. And it's actually those situations that I want to talk about. During the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, the US President John F. Kennedy really just wanted to find the best way to have the missiles removed from Cuba peacefully. And the leader of the Soviet Union kind of just wanted to have their secret operation to be swept under the rug without repercussion. And obviously the result of the entire crisis was a mutual agreement to have nukes removed from Cuba and Turkey. However, what took place during the 13 days of the crisis left humanity inches from ceasing to exist. One notable incident that took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis happened on October 25th, 1962. It was late at night at the Duluth, Minnesota military base, when one of the guards noticed a suspicious figure climbing the fence into the military base. Obviously, the guard understood what was going on and realized that this military base was under attack. He quickly ran to his post and pulled a sabotage alarm. However, by some, the sabotage alarm was misunderstood and was actually taken as an alarm that activated a launch alert at Volk Field in Wisconsin. And this launch alert that was activated at Volk Field prompted the immediate deployment of nuclear-armed jets. With these nuclear-armed jets having their sights aimed at basically anything Soviet, if one of them were to have fired on Soviet or potentially even Cuban troops, America would have likely been met with nuclear retaliation, sparking the first ever nuclear war. Now here's the interesting part. After these alarms were set off, it was discovered that there was no person sabotaging or climbing into the military base at all. What the guard had noticed was actually a bear climbing the military base fence. And with that discovery, the launch of the nuclear-armed planes was canceled with only minutes to spare before pilots took off and the first nuclear war ever would have begun. This was only one example of numerous odd situations that took place during an extremely tense time where the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was razor thin. And even mistaking a bear on a military base in Minnesota could have caused the world to end. World War II. Okay, hear me out. I figured if we're gonna talk about the time we almost had a nuclear war, we should probably talk about the time there was literally nukes dropped within war. But I know I've talked about World War II a lot on this channel, so I'll keep this segment brief. I would say at this point, it's generally accepted that World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The entire 6-year war involved over 100 million people from 30 different countries, and battles literally took place on every continent beside Antarctica. And this entire brutal situation ended in 1945 when Germany surrendered to the Allied powers in May, and Japan was forced into submission in August when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. And well, once again, that's a massive oversimplification, you get the idea. World War II was hell on earth and literally killed an estimated 70 to 85 million, which was roughly 3% of the world's population at that time. So not only did the world almost end, but humanity lost 3% of its population, which is insane. But besides all of the crazy things that actually took place in World War II, let's discuss some of the things that almost took place. One of the most notable things that was bubbling was the development of nuclear bombs in the hands of the Nazis. That's right, after attacks on German soil, Hitler wanted to retaliate on American soil badly. He's even quoted saying that he wants to level all of New York and basically capture the rest of America. Hitler wanted so deeply to bring World War II to American soil that he was literally developing a bomber plane that could fly to America and back, and he just so happened at the same time to be developing a nuclear bomb as well. And unfortunately, the Nazis never got their hands on functioning nuclear bombs. I don't think it's hard to imagine what would have happened if they did. And the world that we live in today today would look a lot different, if it even still existed. And just imagine what would have happened if Japan decided to have nuclear retaliation against America. Japan had already successfully brought World War II to American soil, and if they happened to have had functional nukes and a death wish, then they too could have escalated World War II into global annihilation. But of course, during World War II, only America had successfully developed nukes, and as a result, they essentially told the entire world to sit down. And the nukes that were dropped on Japan is still a lesson that has not been forgotten to this day. And I actually think that it's those nukes that were dropped in World War II that gave America and the Soviet Union so much reluctance to actually use the nukes that they were placing, which is a good thing. And thinking about these situations now, it's almost like comparing a balancing act to dominoes. Because in World War II, it seems like one domino hit another domino and the situation kept escalating and escalating until more and more countries and more deaths happened until at the very end, we saw nearly 100 million deaths, every continent, nearly every major country, and the most deadly weapon ever produced finally put a stop to the entire situation. However, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire situation was a balancing act trying to not go too far in either direction to actually trigger anything because the tensions and technology were already so high that one wrong move or one domino falling could have literally led to the end of the world. The Bonilla observation. This genuinely might be my favorite story in the entire video. In the year 1883, there was a Mexican astronomer named Jose Bonilla, and during a regular shift, Bonilla noticed something relatively obscure in his telescope. And for this reason, Bonilla took many photographs and wrote many notes of what he was seeing through his telescope. Interestingly, the photos that he took are regarded as some of the first images of unidentified flying objects, but trust me when I say this section has nothing to do with aliens. The objects that were seen through the telescope were basically impossible to decipher. Like, just look at this image on screen right now. Can you tell what that is? And for that reason, it was basically left to speculation. Bonilla ended up spending 2 days taking 447 ink photographs of the objects he was seeing through his telescope. And in the following years, Bonilla actually had his observations published in a French astronomy magazine. And French astronomers that observed Bonilla's photographs essentially said pretty confidently that there was either birds flying above the telescope or insects crawling on the telescope or something along that line. And roughly 40 years later, in 1920, Bonilla passed away. And while that is where Bonilla's story ends, that's not where the story of his observation ends. Because in October of 2011, 90 years after Bonilla had passed away, another Mexican astronomer decided to take a peek at some of Bonilla's photos. And the conclusion that he came to was not that he had seen geese or dust or bugs, but he actually had witnessed a comet exploding in space. And these modern-day Mexican astronomers were able to extrapolate that, assuming that Bonilla's timings and notes were correct when observing his UFO through his telescope, it's believed that the objects that he was witnessing were roughly 500 to 8,000 kilometers above Earth's surface and roughly 70 meters to 800 meters in length. And because Bonilla observed 447 objects in roughly 3 hours, and over 3,200 objects in a 25-hour period, the modern-day astronomers estimated that the original comet before it exploded had a mass that was roughly equivalent to 8 times of Halley's Comet. But they not only estimated the size of the original comet, but also said that if any of the fragments of this broken comet had impacted with the Earth, it would have likely been the equivalent of 3,275 Tunguska events in 2 days. And if that means nothing to you, then just understand that the Tunguska event was a massive explosion roughly 3 to 50 megatons in size that took place in Russia in 1908. That singular explosion alone was significant. But what these astronomers are claiming is that if these comet fragments that flew extremely close to the Earth had impacted with the Earth, it would have resulted in an explosion over 100,000 megatons in size, causing something they called, quote, probably an extinction event. And while the thought of this story is absolutely terrifying, I also kind of love the implications. There was a Mexican astronomer who saw something interesting and spent 2 days studying it. He submits his notes and photos for publishing in France, and they basically go, oh, you saw a bird, you saw a bug. He then dies, and 100 years later, other Mexican astronomers are like, oh, no, that's not a bird or a bug. That was basically the closest we've ever come to asteroid-induced human annihilation in, well, a long time. The Lake Toba eruption. Every situation we've discussed so far has occurred in roughly modern history. However, this is the turning point of the video where we get prehistoric, which is actually a good thing because the situations we're about to discuss are literally insane. And the Lake Toba super eruption is a great start to the second half of this list. Lake Toba, Indonesia is the modern day location of one of the most severe volcanic eruptions possibly in all of Earth's history. And it's believed by some that the result of this eruption was a trackable decline in human genetic variation. But let me take a step back. The Toba super eruption that we're discussing is actually the most recent in a series of eruptions that happened in the same volcano. This Toba eruption we're discussing took place only 74,000 years ago. And I say only because the eruption that took place before this one took place 1.2 million years ago, meaning that within the context, this one wasn't too long ago. Regardless, this eruption was significant. And as I mentioned, it was a super eruption. And what qualifies it as a super eruption was the fact that it had an estimated volcanic index of 8, making it the largest known explosive volcanic eruption in almost all of Earth's history. And I know that kind of just sounds like a lot of big numbers, but to kind of try to put this in a bit of context, in 2022, when the Hunga Tonga eruption took place, that volcanic eruption was estimated to have released 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash. And if you look at the pictures and videos and satellite imagery of that explosion, that is so much ash that was released, and it was truly a devastating event. However, if you think 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash is a lot, the Toba super eruption released 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. And this volcanic material had a major impact on the Earth's climate. Unsurprisingly, this volcanic eruption caused a volcanic winter, but this winter was rather significant, not only because it blocked out the sun's rays from entering the Earth's atmosphere, causing a global cooling by several degrees, but it's also believed that this period caused a 1,000-year cold period following the initial volcanic winter. Although that claim is disputed by some, and others say it would have only lasted 3 to 6 years before temperatures would have gotten within a few degrees of, once again, normal. Regardless if the cooling period was 6 years or 1,000 years, the effects were the same. Crops and vegetation across the world withered and died off, causing animals to die, and therefore massive famines among early human populations. And this volcanic winter isn't just speculation either. Core samples from both Greenland and Antarctica confirm a sharp cooling period at this exact time in history. But this is where things get really interesting, because some researchers believe that the Toba eruption was so significant that it's actually linked to a genetic bottleneck that took place during human evolution. And within this theory, it's believed that the global human population was drastically reduced to essentially a few thousand humans. That's it. Just imagine that, a global population of humans in the thousands. That is a crazy thought. And to some researchers, it's believed that this catastrophic event is the exact reason why there is a relatively low level of genetic variation in humans, because there was a time where so many humans were wiped out, and we all stem from a group of a few thousand humans roughly 75,000 years ago. And while this theory isn't necessarily proven or unproven, in the scientific world it's considered controversial, as the theory is making a bold claim and it's not quite proven yet, and there is some physical evidence to disprove it as well, meaning the conversation is still actively ongoing and relatively heated as well. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. The facts are this: 74,000 years ago, there was one of the biggest volcanic eruptions of all time, and it undoubtedly had a huge impact on human, animal, and vegetative life across the entire globe. And while the Toba super eruption is crazy to think about, it's even crazier to imagine what would have happened if the circumstances were just a bit worse, and if the Earth just got a little bit colder. Because if that were the case, potentially those last few thousand humans wouldn't have existed, and you and I would not be here to tell the story today. The Chicxulub impact. Okay, quickly before we get into this one, I realized how short we are for time, so if you guys are enjoying this video and want a part 2 with near world-ending events, please either leave a like or leave a comment telling me you want part 2. I'd be happy to make it, but for this video, I gotta kind of end it in this section. But with that being said, we're ending on a bang, literally. The Chicxulub impact is likely the most famous asteroid impact on Earth in the last billion years, let's say. If you're telling yourself, I've never heard of the Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater, then allow me to speak in more broad terms. The Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater is believed to be the impact site of the asteroid that killed 75% of all life on Earth. All plants, all animals, all vegetation, and this includes the death of all dinosaurs. I should reiterate that it's not the death of this life forms, it's the instant extinction of these life forms, meaning that likely 99.9% of all animals died, but 75% of all life forms were permanently extinct forever. But that's not even the craziest part. What's crazy is that for decades now, researchers have believed that dinosaurs must have been taken out by something instant and likely not from this world. And while this was unproven and unpopular in the scientific community, evidence was building. Specifically, a definitive layer of clay within the Earth's sedimentary rock that is dated to be roughly 66 million years old and is full of an element known as iridium. Interestingly, iridium is technically considered to be the most rare element in all of the Earth's crust, meaning that when it was found in levels that were over 100 times normal, there was something to be said there. And interestingly, iridium is more commonly found in asteroids in space than it is on Earth, further validating the theory that potentially there was a massive impact that took place on Earth And during the impact, the asteroid vaporized, shooting all of this iridium into the atmosphere, settling across the entire globe in this layer of sedimentary rock. But still, this wasn't enough to satisfy the scientific community, and it wasn't until the 1970s when it was proven that there was an impact site hidden off the coast of Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this took place when an oil rig was drilling off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. What this company found when drilling wasn't oil, but actually shocked quartz, which can only be found in large amounts at an asteroid impact site, further validating the theory at the time that there was a massive impact that took place that also caused a global event. I could go really deep into the weeds about the scientific politics that took place during the entire discovery of the situation, but the result was this. It was eventually found out and confirmed that there is a massive impact site off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The crater is roughly 200 kilometers in diameter and roughly 30 kilometers deep. It's believed that the asteroid was roughly 19 kilometers wide and approached Earth at a speed of 36,000 miles per hour. And the impact that took place 66 million years ago had results that life on Earth had likely never seen before. The direct impact itself is estimated to have an explosion equivalent to a bomb that was over 100 million megatons in size. And the result of this violent explosion was global earthquakes in magnitudes over 10, massive global tsunamis, massive global volcanic eruptions, massive global forest fires due to flaming debris falling essentially globally, and then global cooling caused by all of the debris that was sent into the atmosphere, blocking out any natural sunlight. Literally, just imagine the strongest forest fires, the strongest winds, the strongest storms, the strongest explosions, the strongest earthquakes, the strongest natural disasters, all happening all at once times 1 million. I am literally struggling to find the metaphors and words to try to convey the power and impact of this sheer event. And honestly, I feel like I'm doing a poor job, so just understand this. The Chicxulub impact was undoubtedly one of the most, if not the most, significant times in history when not only humanity, but the world was closest to ending. Ancient mysteries that were finally solved. The collapse of classic Mayan civilization. The ancient Maya civilization has some of the coolest lore when it comes to ancient history, most notably because of their architecture, their mathematics, their astronomical system, and likely most famously, their calendar. In case you've been living under a rock, remember when in 2012 everybody thought the world was just gonna, end? That was because of the Mayan calendar, and that actually wasn't an end of the world prediction, it was actually more or less of a formatting error. Regardless, the Mayan civilization was an extremely advanced civilization that existed for thousands of years. And it's recorded that the Mayan civilization dates back as far as 2000 BC, obviously starting from humble beginnings, consisting of simple villages and early agricultural development. It took roughly 1200 years from 2000 BC to 750 BC for the Maya civilization to start seeing significant societal development, specifically with the development of large architectural projects and even writing. These early years in Mayan history are known as the pre-classic era, and I guess there's three primary time periods when speaking on Mayan history: pre-classic period, the classic period, and the post-classic period. And the collapse of Mayan civilization we're going to be talking about is specifically the collapse of the classic period, which is the one that was most mysterious and only recently understood fully. From roughly 2000 BC to 250 AD, the Mayan civilization was developed greatly, which leads us to the classical period of the Mayan civilization. This classic period of Mayan civilization is typically categorized by construction and urbanism, and on top of the already established development in architecture, agriculture, and scripting, there was now also significant development in intellectual and artistic activities, which are some of the most famous and celebrated parts of Mayan culture still to this day. During this classic period from 250 AD to 900 AD, there was cities with populations as large as 120,000 people, and there was numerous cities spread across all of Maya with established trade networks connecting all of them. But this major development brings us to our first historical mystery. From the ancient times going back as far as 2000 BC to more early modern times in 900 AD, the Mayan civilization saw immense development in almost every aspect of society. They had trade, architecture, agriculture, literature, art. It seemed like the Mayan civilization only had progress. But then something interesting happened. During the 9th century, it seemed like almost out of nowhere, Mayan cities were just collapsing and being abandoned, leaving these prosperous and developed cities to essentially rot for a reason that no archaeologist could understand until now. For the longest time, archaeologists that dedicated their life to understand the Mayans could not pin a single answer to this question. What happened to classic Mayan civilization? There was no one ice age or asteroid or army or anything they could pin on this time frame to draw a reasonable conclusion to why such a developed and growing civilization would essentially just abandon their homeland. That was until 2012, when it was discovered that there was no one reason for the collapse of classic Maya. It was actually a combination of issues that caused an interconnected crisis this. And it took experts from a plethora of different studies to kind of come to this conclusion, including archaeologists, scientists, and satellite imaging experts. But here's the conclusion that they eventually came to. One of the biggest factors that played a major role in these classic Mayan cities being abandoned was essentially a major political collapse. And even that collapse is multifaceted, because even that political instability was caused by a number of factors. So before we just blame everything on political instability, let's kind of look at the landscape of the time. Near the end of the classic Maya civilization, there was a lot going wrong. Specifically, deforestation, overpopulation, and drought, which all ultimately led to a massive lack of food. At this point in time, there was already a multi-decade-long drought going on in the area. Little to no rain, streams drying up, and soil fertility was at an all-time low. Coupling this with environmental stress from the deforestation, paired with also an exponentially growing population at the time, meant that things were only destined to fail. And because of this, the thriving, developed city that was sustaining all of this life and growth was now crumbling beneath its feet because it couldn't sustain all of these people. But on top of people just being too crowded and too hungry, the current system of government almost had no capabilities of solving this issue at all. Specifically because the classic Mayan civilization was based on the ritual authority of the ruler, which means the Mayan ruler was only able to control things like construction, warfare, and ritual. Essentially things that only related to the Mayan tradition. But things like agriculture, food trade, and food distribution were completely out of the ruler's hands, meaning that there was no real system of power in place that could help end these ongoing issues that were at this point exponential. And because of the ongoing drought, the exponential growth of the population, and the lack of agricultural support, people had no other chance than to abandon these cities that they were living in, and most people ended up heading northward, abandoning this classic Mayan civilization that they had spent, at this point, thousands of years building. And while this 2012 conclusion kind of solves the mystery of what happened to classic Maya, the story of the Mayan civilization doesn't end there, because Mayan history didn't die out with classic Maya. There is still a post-classic period that went on, although it's an unfortunate one. This political instability that was experienced in classic Maya kind of echoed through post-classic Maya, and this continued instability didn't allow the Mayan people to settle as quickly and rebuild as they would have in previous times. But the major nail in the coffin, which was no mystery, was what happened at the very end of all Mayan civilization, which happened in the mid-1500s, and can be summarized in two words: Spanish conquests. The post-classic Mayan civilization was simply no match for the germs, steel, and armies that the Spanish had at the time. And while the Mayan civilization obviously no longer exists today, their descendants definitely do. And globally, there's over 6 million people that are still speaking the 28 different Mayan languages. Most of these people living in similar areas to where their ancestors did, which is pretty cool that their culture is able to live on. But yeah, archaeologists were stumped why Mayan civilization seemingly had a random exodus during the 9th century, and it took all the way up until 2012 for the solution to be unveiled: self-healing Roman concrete. At this point, I really don't think I need to explain why the Roman Empire was so impressive. The feats and lore of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire are just so cool. And we've talked about a lot of this history on this channel. Actually, my second video ever on this channel was about why Rome even fell in the first place. But that brings us to our next mystery. As I'm hoping most of you know, Rome fell a very long time ago. Although in the modern day, we still have a lot of architecture from ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. And this has puzzled archaeologists for centuries. And it's a reasonable question. How did the Romans have such effective, long-lasting structures made out of concrete that didn't have rebar, and they didn't have any of the modern math or tools or tricks that we have today with our modern concrete structures? There's a saying that goes, modern times require modern solutions, but I think there should also be a saying, ancient times require ancient solutions. And the ancient solutions that the Romans used for their concrete was genius. And it's definitely not an accident that so many Roman ruins are still in remarkable condition to this very day. In January of 2023, not even 3 years ago, a group of scientists from MIT and Harvard were doing a deep dive into Roman concrete when they finally came to the conclusion of the Romans' concrete success. And it's actually rather interesting. But let's take a step back. Before this discovery in MIT in 2023, all of the building blocks of Roman concrete were known. We knew that the Romans used volcanic rock, volcanic ash, seawater, and a little bit of slacked lime, essentially a limestone water mixture. But here's the caveat. Prior to this discovery in 2023, the going belief was that this slacked lime and limestone was not an actual important component in this concrete construction. It was more or less of a byproduct of poor patchwork and didn't actually belong to make the concrete better. It was just kind of there by mistake or due to low quality materials. But the irony is that this is actually the complete opposite of the truth. This limestone and slack lime in this Roman concrete was the exact reason for its longevity over thousands of years. You see, the limestone wasn't there for looks or because it was cheap to add into concrete. The Romans knew that limestone would react with water in a way that would be beneficial for the concrete's longevity. Essentially, what the Romans Romans would do was they would create a concrete mixture, ensuring that pieces of limestone and slack lime were inside of the concrete made from this volcanic ash and seawater. And as this concrete was being processed and cured, there would essentially be small pockets of slack lime and limestone throughout all of the cement. Just imagine mint chocolate chip ice cream. The concrete is the mint ice cream, and then the chocolate chips are all the little bits of slack lime and limestone. And I apologize for not giving a trigger warning for mint chip ice cream. I know it's a very controversial ice cream, but I'm just gonna say it. I like it. Back to the mystery though, although this limestone didn't necessarily serve a huge purpose when the concrete was fresh and intact, as the concrete would begin to settle and shift and crack over time, this would expose the chunks of slack lime and limestone. And this is exactly where the magic happens. As these bits of slack lime and limestone would be exposed, water would begin to enter these cracks, and the reaction between the limestone and the water would cause a chemical reaction that would essentially begin to self-heal the concrete. And this seemingly rudimentary solution was actually the cornerstone of Roman concrete success, and the solution to a mystery that went on for decades. Strange Peruvian holes. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the early 1900s walking through rural Peru. It's hot, sunny, and you're getting pretty miserable when you notice a strange structure in the ground. It's a spirally, rocky thing, and you have no idea what it is. You take note of it, but keep moving, because it honestly could be anything. When eventually you notice another one, and then another one. You notice at this point so many throughout the day that you just can no longer ignore it, and you make a note of it. You bring it back to your archaeological buddies, but nobody has an answer. Nobody's seen these before, and they're not quite sure what these are or what their purpose was. These strange structures in the deserts of southern Peru likely had a purpose, but what was that purpose? The ancient Nazca people lived here, but were they advanced enough to build anything like this? And if they were building these things, what were they building them for? You ditch your friends and go to the library to try to find any archaeological archives of these structures existing, and there's really nothing you can find. You've been able to read historical accounts confirming that other people have seen these in the past, although any historical data is scarce, and there's absolutely no answer about them, only an acknowledgement of their existence. So at this point, you're stumped. And with this discovery, you set out on a journey for answers, but what you end up starting is a massive conspiracy theory on what these things could be. Decades after you first saw these in the early 1900s, theories are becoming more and more widespread as other archaeologists have began to study the Nazca area of Peru. At this point, it was believed that the Nazca people had pre-Columbian origins in this region, with a culture that likely flourished from 100 BC to 800 AD. But it was also believed that these structures were similar to Spanish mines and subterranean canals. And so by some, it was initially believed that these structures were potentially Spanish, although that theory was soon to be proven very wrong. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, a group of Italian researchers and archaeologists decided to study the Nazca area of Peru using satellite imaging, something that at that point hadn't been done yet for this purpose. And what they found was amazing. What they discovered was that this system of structures was much more extensive than they initially thought, and they even saw that these structures were present in nearby settlements, which were dated and identified separately from this discovery. Further investigation showed that there was even structures in the Nazca drainage basin, which ultimately gave a lot more context to what these structures could have been. And it was ultimately concluded that these mysterious seeming structures were a subterranean irrigation system, or simply put, an underground well basically, to transfer water between settlements and areas in this vast desert. And with this discovery, it was ruled that no, the Spanish didn't build these. And while the Spanish could have very easily leveraged them while they were in the area, these specific structures were pre-Hispanic. And in 2017, the general consensus was that these structures were built as far back as 500 AD. And the combination of all of these discoveries definitely made some archaeologists reconsider how advanced they believed the Nazca people to be. The 4,000-year-old comb. In 2016, a group of archaeologists were in the ruins of Lachish, an ancient Canaanite city-state which is located in modern-day Israel. During this dig, they found a very interesting artifact that ended up being a very significant discovery for ancient language. During this dig, one of the archaeologists found an ivory comb. It doesn't really sound super exciting until you understand that this ivory comb was literally 3,700 years old. This ivory comb was made out of elephant ivory, and while this discovery in this artifact is amazing, it doesn't end there. On this small comb, there was a very faint and small sentence written. But what was interesting was, even though this artifact was extremely old, nearly 4,000 years old, the sentence that was written used the phonetic alphabet, which was extremely uncommon for this time. Typically during this time frame, hieroglyphs or other forms of script were what people used. So finding the phonetic alphabet was very interesting. But while this ancient artifact was cool, the mystery still stood. What did this say? And this mystery was actually relatively short-lived, as after it was found in 2016, the code was deciphered in 2021. And what was engraved on the comb goes as follows: "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard." And I guess this was more or less of a blessing of your hair, or maybe a threat against potential lice living in your hair. Regardless, it's so cool that they were actually actually able to translate what was on this 4,000-year-old artifact. And historians believe that this artifact likely came from Egypt, because the region in which this artifact was found had no elephants anywhere nearby. And it was believed that this artifact was owned by a wealthy trader who was able to get luxury goods from other parts of the world. And who knows, maybe even just getting lice out of your hair during this time period was a luxury. So if I was one of the archaeologists on this dig, assuming that the structural integrity was solid on this comb, I would definitely run it through my hair, just to say I did it. And yes, I have hair. The mystery of the Ryukyu Islands. The Ryukyu Islands are a chain of small, isolated islands in the western Pacific Ocean off the coast of Japan and east of China. In the modern day, these islands are part of the Okinawa prefecture in Japan, but that wasn't always the case. In the history of people on these islands actually go as far back as 35,000 years ago. But this is where the mystery comes into play. When human remains were first discovered on these islands and they were dated all the way back to the Paleolithic period, people were astonished to see any human life on this island. And because of that, the initial theory was that these people must have gotten here by accident, and that there was simply no way that people would intentionally sail so far to these remote islands, hundreds of kilometers away from any other major civilization. But that begs the question, if people never got to this island intentionally and only got here by accident, how did they get here by accident? And it was that exact question that a group of US-based researchers planned to answer. This study went on for a long time too. From 1989 all the way up until 2017, these organizations dropped 138 buoys from the eastern coast of Taiwan, as well as the northern tip of the Philippines. And they picked both of these two locations specifically because they were part of the Kuroshio Current, the world's fastest ocean current that literally almost hasn't changed in the last 100,000 years, so the data should be relatively consistent. And what they found after dropping all of these buoys from both of these locations, out of 138 of these buoys, none of them floated to these islands, and only 4 of them floated within a 20-kilometer radius of any of the islands, basically blowing up the theory that the humans that were on this island got there by accident, and further validated the theory that prehistoric humans set sail intentionally to find these islands and intentionally inhabited them. And it's just interesting because 35,000 years ago, these prehistoric humans were getting on boats and floating to undiscovered islands. And while this doesn't necessarily confirm that this is exactly what happened, researchers that were part of the project did say, quote, "It was more likely that the early seafarers had more carefully plotted their courses than had been assumed," which I think is a nice way of saying we underestimated these fuzzballs. But at least it does shine light on how these people even got to this island in the first place. Ancient perfume. Here's the deal. We live very differently from our ancient ancestors, but we actually kind of share a lot of similar traits and even in some cases luxuries. And one example of that is perfume. Nowadays, you know, it never hurts to put on a little Dior Sauvage, or maybe if you're in middle school, a little Axe body spray to, you know, get the pheromones going. But this seemingly modern activity is actually nothing of the sort. And our ancient ancestors were no stranger to putting on a little stank for the ladies. Or the guys. Let me explain. For a very long time, it was known and understood that our ancient ancestors used perfume. There was writings, there was evidence, they knew that this was a luxury item that the rich enjoyed. But up until a certain point, there was never any evidence of it around. And there was very little hope that we would be able to ever smell ancient perfume. That was until a jar of Roman perfume was found in a Spanish villa, in an ancient burial site where Roman settlers once lived. This perfume that was found was contained in a quartz bottle, which alone was considered to be a luxury item of the time. But it doesn't end there. This quartz bottle was hidden in a dark and dry place, and it was also tightly sealed in a tar-like substance that was later revealed to be bitumen. And because of the nearly perfect conditions that this perfume was kept in, the internal contents were preserved. And this was a massive discovery into what the Romans liked to smell like. Previous to this discovery, it was pretty well known that the Romans would use olive oil and other oils and animal fats as a base of their perfumes and colognes, and obviously that they used colognes and perfumes. But with this discovery, researchers were actually able to smell for the first time ever what Roman perfume would have smelled like. Laboratory analyses of the bottle revealed that the primary scent, at least in this bottle of perfume, was patchouli. And this was kind of an amazing discovery because patchouli is a tropical plant from Southeast Asia and was likely brought to Rome through trade networks. Now, I want to reiterate that the scientists didn't just pop off the cap and smell it and, oh wow, it smells like patchouli, this smells so good. Like, no, like the internal contents were preserved but not necessarily fresh. And it took a chemical analysis to even be able to identify the patchouli's chemical signature in the mush that was in this quartz flask. But it was obviously enough to give us a very interesting insight into what the Romans used for the perfume. And it solved a pretty cool mystery that we didn't even know we wanted the answer to. Roman coins found in Japan. We've already talked about ancient Rome in this video, and we're talking about them again, because when we're talking about cool ancient history and ancient mysteries, they're worth bringing up. Now, one ancient mystery about the Roman Empire was exactly how far were their trade routes established. For example, it was known that the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China knew of each other's existences, but it was kind of believed that they had no formal relationship, and their only understanding of each other kind of came through the established trade route that was basically spread across all of Eurasia, which was the very famous Silk Road. Both the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire profited greatly from this trade route, but it still begs the question, how strong was the influence of the Roman Empire in Asia, specifically when it came to trade? And also, how far beyond the Han Dynasty did their trade go? And this mystery brings us to Japan in 2016, when a group of archaeologists were doing a dig and they found some weird little pebbles. But these weren't pebbles, these were ancient Roman coins from the 3rd and 4th century AD. These coins had Constantine the Great on them. And this discovery kind of made the mystery even bigger, because now the obvious question was, how did these coins get here? Who had these ancient Roman coins, and what were they doing in Japan? Were they trading? Were they stolen? Were they a gift? Who knows? But what archaeologists were able to kind of draw from this discovery was that the ancient Romans' trade influence had roots much deeper in Asia than they initially thought. And to think that this trade route went as far as the Japanese island is pretty cool. Could you imagine being one of the archaeologists on this dig? You find it, you're very well versed in ancient Roman history, and you're like, oh my god, this is a Constantine coin, I know this. And then you go to your friends, you're like, guys, I found an artifact. You're like, oh, what'd you find? I'm like, I found ancient Roman coins. They're like, where'd you find it? And then you have to go, Japan. And then instantly everybody you're speaking to thinks that you are the dumbest person alive, only for you to then be proved as a legend for finding such a cool artifact in such a unique place. Like, imagine if your friend just went on a trip to Italy and he's like, dude, I went on an excursion and I did an archaeological dig and I found this cool ancient samurai sword. I'm sure your first thought to your friend would be, oh man, bless my friend's heart. He thought a Roman sword was a samurai sword. But then he FaceTimes you only to show you that, no, he literally found a Japanese samurai sword in, the Roman Empire. That's only how I can imagine this kind of conversation went. Because I definitely would assume that most archaeologists wouldn't assume that they're finding ancient Roman coins when doing a dig in Okinawa, Japan. The Tully Monster. The year is 1958, and you are an archaeologist working in the Mazon Creek fossil beds when you have just found a very interesting fossil. This fossil isn't like anything you've seen before, and it kind of looks like fossilized poo, an ancient, toy, some sort of large peanut. Whatever it was, you have never seen this before, and neither have any of your archaeological or scientific friends. Not only have they not seen this before, everybody was baffled and confused on what this fossil could be. And from the year 1958 until 2016, the origins of this 6-inch long, large wood-looking, bug-looking thing had no explanation. All anybody knew was that there was a hard outer shell, 2 eyes, 2 long stalks that protruded out of the head, but beyond that, everything was up for debate. But one of the hottest debates was whether this creature was a vertebrate or an invertebrate. But that debate was closed in 2016. And I just have to say, man, 2016 was such a good year for discoveries, because I feel like so many things we've discussed on this list have been from 2016. So shout out 2016. Honestly, just a good year all around. I was in high school at the time, just carefree, just having fun. I'm not one of those people that said high school was way more fun. I have a lot more fun now, I think. But high school, there's a certain charm to it. You have no responsibility in life. We're off topic. In 2016, after nearly 50 years of studying this thing, it was confirmed that this wooden-looking bug was confirmed to be a 307 million year old invertebrate creature. It was labeled as a jawless fish, and it had many similarities to the lamprey. Not everything is known about this creature, obviously, and work is still being done on the fossil, but the major points of contention are, case closed now. And this is an invertebrate creature that is literally 307 million years old. So crazy. Also, I find it kind of funny that the scientific name for the Tully monster is the Tully monstrum. Like, okay, you can put it in a suit. We all see through that. But in case I haven't shown any images of what artists think the Tully monstrum looked like back in the day, here are some images and renders. And I think that these look a lot better than the poo-looking fossil that was originally found. Oh, and I guess kind of a wholesome note, this creature is literally called the Tully monster because it was found by a man named Frank Tully. Look at this guy. Legend. The craziest revenge stories in human history. The year is 1860, and it was a crisp October evening in Hartford, Connecticut. A young, loving couple sat beside their fire in their relatively modest shack, anxiously awaiting the delivery of their new baby boy. And while these soon-to-be parents would be overjoyed to have a baby that is nothing more than happy, healthy, and ordinary, little did they know the son that they were just about to have would not only be extraordinary, but would literally become something of legend. And after hours of torturous labor, this legend was born, with the official birthday of October 26th, 1860, and the legal name of Frank Boardman Eden. Although it was the alias he was given later in life that would become his globally recognized name. Frank was a normal and happy child, He enjoyed playing with his friends, he enjoyed time outside, and he particularly enjoyed spending quality time with his father, at least as much as he could get. At the age of 8, Frank and his family moved from Hartford, Connecticut down to Twin Mound, Kansas. And this move, unfortunately, was a turning point in Frank's life. Shortly after Frank and his family moved to Kansas, it was obvious they did not fit in. Frank's father was an abolitionist, although the city they moved to had a pretty strong Confederate population. And during this time, those two did not get along at all. Now, while Frank was initially upset about the move, he quickly made new friends in Kansas, and it almost seemed like his new home. Although, for Frank's parents, it was somewhat obvious that trouble was brewing, although they kept their fears away from Frank. That was until they couldn't anymore. Not even 1 year after moving to Kansas, Frank's father was shot dead in cold blood by 6 former Confederate soldiers. These former soldiers were part of a vigilante Southerners group who called themselves the Regulators, and they believed it was totally acceptable to use violence on your political enemies. The news of his father passing devastated both Frank and his mother. Frank's mother was concerned about how she would make ends meet and how she would take care of her boy on her own, and Frank had no idea what life would be like without his best friend. After the murder, many members of the community went to visit their new neighbors and pay their condolences. But it was one man who visited the family that left a particular impact on Frank. This man was named Moses Beeman. He was a friend of Frank's father, and he had one important message for Frank. During his visit, he took Frank in a separate room, sat him down, looked him dead in the eye, and told him the following: "My boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." He said nothing else to the 8-year-old child. He hugged his mother, and he left the house, leaving Frank with a heavy heart and a confused mind. The following week, Moses returned, although he didn't have an order. This time, he had an objective. He took Frank into the backyard, set up some cans on a fence post, and pulled out a gun. At this point, Frank had seen guns but was not familiar, and was more or less traumatized by the thought of handling a gun, due to how his late father died. Although Moses ensured it was okay and safe, and the two began to shoot. And from the age of 8 to 15, Frank, both with Moses and by himself, took shooting very seriously, and very quickly gained expert levels of marksmanship with no formal training. At the age of 15, Frank decided that it was time to get formal training. He, although being young in modern standards, felt like a man at the time. He had been taking care of his mother for years now, and he felt like the time was right. Frank set out to visit Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. Although when Frank arrived at the fort, he was quickly turned away, being told he was too young to join the army. Feeling like it was too late to turn back, Frank felt desperate. And it was at that moment that he looked the colonel dead in the eyes and told him, "I know I can't join the army yet, but I just need to learn how to shoot. Please, even for a day, take me in. For all you know, I might even be a better shot than some of your soldiers." And while the colonel saw this as disrespect, he also saw this as a challenge, and he took Frank in to humble him. During his time in the fort, Frank reportedly outshot everybody in the fort, and even kept up with the top marksmen in the army. Frank stayed for much longer than he anticipated and participated in many shooting competitions at the fort. So many, in fact, that the commanding officer and that same colonel, John J. Coppener, gave Frank a marksmanship badge and also gave him the now legendary nickname of Pistol Pete. After spending years practicing at home and now having the affirmation of the government for being an extremely skilled marksman, Frank felt emboldened to act on the mission he was given as an 8-year-old boy. Remembering what Moses told him in the hours Moses spent with him, he knew what he had to do. And over the next decade, Frank hunted down and killed every single one of his father's murderers, except for one, who unfortunately passed away before Frank could get to him. After seemingly accomplishing his mission, Frank felt proud and once again lost, and he ended up settling in Oklahoma and decided to use his skills for good and became a sheriff and later a blacksmith. And he also went on to become married, have 9 kids, 31 grandkids, and even live long enough to see 3 of his great-great-grandchildren. Frank, or Pistol Pete, passed away on April 8th, 1958, at the ripe age of 97. And while he has been gone for decades now, his story is definitely still around. And in my opinion, it's one of the coolest revenge stories of human history. But we're also just getting started. I don't know, I really wanted to start the story with Pistol Pete because I thought the story was so cool. You know, almost like a Batman vibe. Like, he was literally given the task as an 8-year-old boy, hey, you have to kill everybody who killed your father or you will be cursed. Like, that's a crazy thing to say to an 8-year-old, but he did it. He took it seriously, he learned marksmanship, he avenged his father, and then used his skills for good. But on top of just being a legend for that, Frank was also a legend for being very personable. And he was so personable and outgoing, in fact, that him riding a horse at a parade in 1923 is the reason why Oklahoma State University has the mascot of Pistol Pete. Students of what would later become Oklahoma State University literally saw Frank on a horse, being Frank and just doing outrageous things and being outgoing, and decided that this guy is the perfect representation of our school. And for that reason, they petitioned to change the mascot, and well, the rest is history. Because it wouldn't be until 1958 that a caricature of Frank known as Pistol Pete would become the official mascot. And the now iconic logo was not even a licensed symbol until the 1980s, obviously long after Frank passed away. Since Frank's passing, he has won multiple awards. Most notably, in 1997, he was inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and in 2022, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Center in Oklahoma. And literally only last year, in 2025, he was also inducted into the Oklahoma State University Hall of Fame, further proving that Pistol Pete is a legend. And in Oklahoma, he is very much so appreciated. Frank had a normal upbringing, but because of unfortunate circumstances outside of his control, his father was taken from him and he was given a mission he would go on to fulfill and then live a long, prosperous life. Honestly, that's how you make lemonade out of lemons. But we're only just getting started and we have more stories to get into. The year is 963. Harold Bluetooth, the King of Denmark, and his wife were both awaiting the delivery of their son. Although this time, they weren't in a modest shack. They were in a quite luxurious castle. After hours of grueling labor and beating all odds, the queen survived, and the baby boy was born happy and healthy. And his name was Sweyn Forkbeard. Growing up as the son of the King of Denmark, Sweyn had a much different upbringing than most Danes. Sweyn was born into one of the most iconic bloodlines in all of Viking history, and it was for this reason that he had massive shoes to fill. Fortunately, due to his unique upbringing, he was exposed to knowledge and education that most Danes could never dream of, and it was this experience in his early life that set him up for success as a strong leader. Without having really any recorded facts of the upbringing of Sweyn, there's not much to report about his early life, besides the fact that it is very likely that he was exposed to warfare, strategy, and swordsmanship at a very young age, and this was proven later in life. As Sweyn began to develop from a young boy to a young man, he began to have more and more tension with his father, or at least his father figure, because it is believed that Harold Bluetooth is likely not the biological father of Sweyn, but more likely the stepfather, with the biological father being Harold's brother who passed away before Sweyn was ever born, marrying his brother's widow and taking on the child as his own. That, on a surface level, seems admirable, although, as we will go on to learn, this decision was likely his downfall. As Sweyn grew from a young boy to a young man, he felt he was ready to take on responsibility, and Sweyn approached his father, asking him for a piece of Denmark, something that he could own and rule and practice his kingsmanship in, although Bluetooth denied the request, and Sweyn took this rejection as an act of war. Sweyn quickly decided that he only had one option if he truly wanted to gain power, and that was to take it. And shortly after this denial, he began gathering an army, telling Bluetooth that he was going to go on a raid at some point. However, in reality, the swords he was collecting were going to be pointed at his father. Now, the reason why Sweyn went to such extreme lengths to betray his father are debated, although it's not believed that he tried to overthrow his father simply just because he was denied land. It is believed that it was the combination of this land denial on top of another factor that caused, well, such a violent overthrowing, which we will discuss. Those two additional factors that are debated, well, are the following. Some believe that it was around this time where Sweyn found out that Bluetooth was not his true biological father, therefore emboldening him to overthrow Bluetooth because he was the true heir to the throne, not Bluetooth. And the other belief is that Sweyn simply did not like the Christianization of Denmark, and that's because Bluetooth was the first king of Denmark to be baptized and accept Christianity as the primary religion, something that rubbed Sweyn the wrong way, because he held the pagan Viking traditions and beliefs closely to his heart, and his Christianization seemed like a betrayal. Unfortunately, we may never know what the true reasons were. Regardless, a large-scale battle took place. Bluetooth's army actually won the battle. However, Bluetooth sustained a massive injury during the battle and died shortly after. And because of this, Sweyn was now made the King of Denmark. supposedly at the age of 23. During Sweyn's time as the King of Denmark, he was involved in multiple large-scale historic battles, each of which are worthy of a video on their own. But to summarize the next few decades, Sweyn used his might and strategy to take over significant parts of Norway, so much to the fact that he actually became the King of Norway as well in the year 1999, and then set his sights on England. However, the English were not so happy to have the Danes on their land. And it was because of the English's disdain for the Danes in England that the King of England at the time, King Ethelred the Unready, ordered the massacre and mass murder of all of the Danes in England. This event was known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, and it took place in November of 1002. This massacre was undoubtedly tragic for the Danes in England and their families back home. And one of the most notable individuals impacted by this massacre was Sweyn Forkbeard, because both his brother and sister were murdered in this massacre. And it was these exact murders that gave Sweyn the motivation and justification to let all hell break loose on England. And that he did. Sweyn was already occupying parts of England because of the prospect of revenue. Although now with this newfound justification, they wanted not just parts of England, they wanted to rule the entire country. And from the year 1002 to the year 1012, Sweyn engaged in 3 different full-scale battles on England. And by the end of the following year, 1013, Sweyn became the official King of England by means of conquest, making him the king of a 3rd consecutive country, the King of Denmark, the King of Norway, and now the King of England. And with the conquest of this final country, he was able to enact his revenge. Because although the King of England took a brother and a sister from Sweyn Forkbeard, Sweyn took the crown and the country from the King of England, something he likely planned on doing anyway. Although with this added motivation, I'm sure it made the revenge that much sweeter. The full detailed story of Sweyn Forkbeard is obviously something I can't go into in this video. Although I'm really hoping this brief summary gave a pretty good overlook on how one man could lose some siblings, but gain a country. Now, I'm definitely not going to say Sweyn seemed like an innocent, harmless individual. He was a ruthless ruler, and it appears he partook and engaged in some of the very much so common brutality of his day. Although, when a king decides it's acceptable to exterminate an entire group of people, there needs to be pushback. Unfortunately, the King of England just happened to mess with the wrong Viking. Now, I would be lying if I didn't tell the full story, because shortly after taking the crown in England, Sweyn did die. And he died, unfortunately, only 40 days after becoming the King of England, giving him only limited time to enjoy everything he had worked for. It's like they say, is it better to have loved and lost, or never loved at all? In my opinion, the story of Sweyn Forkbeard is so interesting. And the fact that he was the king of 3 countries at once, to me, is mind-blowing. And sure, the guy, overthrew his dad, or stepdad, we don't really know. But when somebody kills your brother and sister, either in law or by blood, taking that individual's crown and country in retaliation seems like pretty sweet revenge. And yet, there's still more to discuss. The year is 1783. 2 new American immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy in Pennsylvania. And I don't know why baby boy is such a cliche in this video. I did not intend this. Regardless, 2 Irish-Scottish immigrants had just given birth to their baby boy. His name was Hugh, and he was about to become, once again, a legend. Hugh's early life is not necessarily well known, although he is extremely famous for what happened near the end of his life. In his early life, Hugh set out to become an explorer, and on one of his expeditions, he was actually essentially enslaved by pirates when his ship was overtaken by pirates, and he was given the ultimatum of either dying or becoming a pirate and fighting with them. He chose life and unfortunately spent multiple years as a pirate doing pirate things. On one of his missions, Hugh decided to ditch his pirate crew and spend time with some of the Native Americans that he had met in Texas. Now, he wasn't intentionally trying to be in Texas, the pirates were simply here, and he decided to just jump ship. Interestingly, the Native Americans that he had met were not fans of pirates whatsoever, and for this reason, he was sentenced to death almost immediately when meeting these natives. It has been reported that right before his execution by the natives, Hugh was able to offer these natives an expensive dye that they could use to dye garments and for war paints, and this was enough to spare his life. And because of this transaction, he was able to not only live, but spend the next couple of years living amongst this tribe, a time when he was able to hone in his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. After Hugh spent multiple years as a pirate and then multiple years as a tribesman, Hugh decided it was time for something new. And it was at this time that he left the group of natives he was living with and decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri in 1821. At this point, Hugh had been on this earth for nearly 40 years and had lived a full life for many up until this point. Although it was this move that he made to St. Louis that would truly cement Hugh Glass as a legend, at least in terms of revenge stories. The following year, after moving to St. Louis, Missouri, Hugh noticed an advertisement in the newspaper, the Missouri Gazette. The advertisement was commissioned by William Henry Ashley, and the advertisement was calling for 100 men to ascend the river Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. And to Hugh, somebody who's lived a rather storied life up until this point, this career opportunity not only sounded exciting, but also seemed like something that was directly within his skill set. And so he decided to respond to the advertisement and get the job. Him and 99 other men, of course. The group of men that ended up getting hired for this position became known as Ashley's 100, which, if you ask me, kind of sounds like another crazy man's challenge, but we'll put that to the side. These Ashley's 100 were some of the most rugged and skilled mountain men that Missouri had to offer. And once the group was fully organized, the following year, they had started their expedition. An expedition that would be longer and harder than Glass could ever imagine. The expedition was almost instantly met with resistance from Native Americans. It was reported that the Americans tried to initiate trade, but were met with violence, which resulted in an all-out war against this native settlement and, well, these traveling traders. The result of this conflict was the entire village being burned down, everyone dying on the native side, and a vast majority of the Ashley 100 dying as well. Following this all-out war on the tribe, Hugh and 13 other men continued their journey to the Yellowstone River, where they intended to trap and fur beavers. To me, that fact alone is crazy, that they literally had a full-scale war during this expedition, and they, just continued to get beaver pelts of all things. Regardless, it wouldn't be this all-out war with the native tribes that would be the source of revenge. That betrayal and revenge would actually come from within the Ashley 100. Once Hugh and the 13 other men finally arrived in Yellowstone, the men split up and began looking for furs. And that was when Hugh stumbled upon an ominously quiet clearing right outside of a small creek. And this area, unfortunately, turned out to be a bear's nest and resulted in Hugh Glass being mauled by a bear severely. This angry, aggressive mother bear threw him to the ground and then pinned him down as she bit into Hugh, threw chunks of his meat to her cubs, and then her cubs also began to attack Hugh as well. To call this bear attack brutal is an understatement, and by the time that his fellow hunters and trappers were able to kill the bears, Hugh was essentially a shell of a man and wasn't even believed to be alive. Although, shockingly, upon further inspection, Hugh was breathing and somehow still alive. Although, just because he was alive now didn't mean he would be alive for long. And because of this, the other men put Hugh on a stretcher and began carrying him, assuming that they would carry him for the day, set up camp, sleep, and in the morning he would be dead and they could bury him. Although, after a day of carrying him, and then after sleeping through the night and finding him still alive, the group decided that it didn't make sense to carry him all the way home, because he obviously wouldn't survive. And the group decided to move on, but they did leave 2 people to watch over Hugh's body so that they could give him a proper burial once he did pass away. These 2 men, Fitzgerald, an older man, and Bridger, a younger boy, only a teen, both watched over Hugh for 5 consecutive days. And shockingly, Hugh survived every single one of those days. Although, to his team members, this was not a miracle. This was a liability. Because these men were still in the middle of the wilderness, and they knew that they had bears and also angry native tribes on their tail. And these men were growing more anxious by the day. And it was on that 5th day that these men decided that they had to abandon Hugh. And that they did. They took his gun and everything of value off his person besides his clothes and left him to die by a creek. However, Hugh didn't die. And what he did next made him the legend that we likely are all familiar with today. And if you've seen the movie The Revenant, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Following being abandoned, Hugh surprisingly was able to come to and regained some form of consciousness, although his body was simply not cooperating. He had multiple broken ribs, a broken arm, a broken leg, and was truly in horrendous shape. However, he did have enough strength to drink water out of the stream, eat berries off of bushes, and gather enough nutrition to sustain himself. And with berries in his belly, he came to terms with the fact that he had been abandoned by his team. And with this realization, he became enraged. So enraged, in fact, that he decided that he would make it back to his camp and confront those men that abandoned him at any cost. And with that, he began the multiple 100-mile trek, starting with just crawling and eventually being able to hobble and walk the entirety of the way. After somehow surviving and maneuvering over 240 miles, Hugh reached a fur trading outpost where he was able to hitch a boat ride back to his original camp. And this was fortunate because this boat ride alone was an additional 300 miles, something that he likely would not have survived on foot. Regardless, after this boat ride, Hugh and the French fur traders he was with were attacked by another Native American tribe, although they were also defended by a separate Native American tribe. And the result of this all-out conflict was the death of everybody in Hugh's camp except for himself. And these Native Americans that saved his life and fought on his behalf, once again, delivered him directly to a separate trading post where he was offered the opportunity to rest, but he did not take it because he had not yet achieved his goal of getting his revenge. Now, mind you, this was 6 months after the bear attack at this point. Everybody who had ever known Hugh would have likely believed he was dead. Although, little did they know, Hugh was very much so alive, and the two men that abandoned him were about to get an earful, to say the least. Shortly after this encounter, Hugh finally made it to Fort Henry, the fort where his original company was supposed to be. And it was there where Hugh ran into Bridger, one of the two men that abandoned him. Although Bridger was not a man, he was a boy. And after Hugh talked to Bridger, he came to the conclusion that Bridger was a bystander. He was simply only following orders and did not intentionally betray Hugh. And because of this, after a harsh winter, Hugh decided to once again continue his journey to find Fitzgerald. He joined another mission to go 400 miles upstream to a new trading post where Fitzgerald was supposed to be, and he was well on his way to get his revenge. Although, once this boat had landed, it was once again attacked by another group of Native Americans. Most of his group died, and Hugh was once again left, I'm not even joking, to his own devices, where he was injured, alone, and had to walk hundreds of miles. After nearly a year of pain, torture, suffering, and, well, anger, Hugh was finally able to run into Fitzgerald at a settlement known as Fort Atkinson. However, at this fort, it was revealed that Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army. And if Hugh wanted to get revenge on Fitzgerald, it would be a death sentence, because killing a soldier was a crime punishable by execution. Although, I don't think Hugh needed to kill Fitzgerald to get his point across, because I'm sure for Fitzgerald, even seeing Hugh would have been shocking. But beyond just making his presence and, well, being alive known to Fitzgerald, Hugh also told Fitzgerald that while he can't kill him now, if he ever leaves the army, he will personally kill Fitzgerald. And while to some that may not sound like the most satisfying revenge, being able to come face to face to the man who abandoned you and not kill him, but to tell him, hey, I'm alive, I survived everything, and I'm not going to kill you. A, because I can't, but B, because you might have worse things coming to you. And while death is a harsh punishment, war is no walk in the park. And I would personally like to believe that being able to overcome and survive everything that Hugh did, coming face to face with the person that abandoned him and telling him off, and being the bigger man was likely the most satisfying thing he could have done in that situation. But for all I know, he could also have just been extremely mad that he was a soldier and was avidly waiting for him to, not be a soldier anymore so he could get his real revenge. But I'll leave that for you guys to decide in the comments. Regardless, hopefully this extremely oversimplified version of the story of Hugh Glass paints just a small picture of how much of a badass he truly was. And if you want to learn more about it, watch the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. Or, if you want a more accurate depiction, read some historical documents. This guy went to hell and back multiple times and could never truly catch a break. Although he was able to survive seemingly the impossible, and he was able to come face to face with the man who left him for dead and tell him that he survived the impossible and that it was Fitzgerald's turn to survive war. The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons, both of those reasons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when three men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of this system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes woods and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles, and also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the 3 of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the 3 of these men? What happened to the 4th man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The 3 men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these 3 men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had 3 men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the 3 men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have 2 more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly where Frank Abagnale Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the two, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abagnale into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abigail's paperwork. And this gave Abagnale a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards. And with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abagnale who was waiting at the mall. And Abagnale played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once, because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending, because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade, and it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell, one of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. But regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshie a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshie wasn't able to just break this wooden wood frame in one go. But similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshie over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshie was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did, and it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshie was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshie at his door and let him in and fed Yoshie and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshie explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshie well. Yoshie explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshie went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshie was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshie requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold conditions. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshie had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound, there was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshie still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshie was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man, and also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escape this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshie still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshie didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization and made the long trek to the nearest city, where where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mineshaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owned this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi, once again, was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshi Shirotori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshi started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshi was going in the opposite direction. Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshi. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshi could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshi was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshi was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time, a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshi is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshi passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that. How to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water were your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore, your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this: shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically null and void because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development. And as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you are someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob with the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. For the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers at be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist, and serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag, the Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're Chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied, 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. For the sake of this story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do you do? Once again, you have 2 options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm going to try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day 1, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work, mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There is a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long-distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intentions. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade, because they, one, have the most money, and two, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they are going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside two rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just want to know when's that money coming into town and what route is it going to take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have two options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately. And fortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money is going missing all the time, and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today. In good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we gonna get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now I gotta get them. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm gonna go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king unless I told him a reason not to. I'm gonna tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete, and together, we set sail. On this boat, I am more or less useless, so I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped, so I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before, at least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in the story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I told the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get the loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The Modern Era. Wow, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel, and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you will be like, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. A step-by-step plan on how you can get rich in every time period. This video was extremely fun to make, and like your mother, it was rather fast and loose. Not too many facts, but a lot of funny hypotheticals based on different circumstances of different time periods. Hopefully you guys liked it.